So many of you all have just started on your freshly milled journey, and I'm so excited. I am using my Impact grain mill to mill some hard white wheat, and we're going to make a loaf of freshly milled sourdough together today. I have to tell you, I'm loving this meal. I think if I could have designed a meal, it would be very similar to this meal. It's just one of those things, I like the way that it works. I like the flour, and it's so inexpensive. So a lot of you all have jumped on the freshly milled train because of this affordable meal. So I wanted to walk you through this. The way that I make my freshly milled sourdough is pretty similar to the way I would make it with all-purpose flour. I put my water and my sourdough starter in a bowl, and I always like to mix it up until it's just a little bit milky looking. Now, I think I had someone ask me if I'm using a freshly milled sourdough starter. This starter was fed with freshly milled hard red wheat, and so you'll notice it's a little darker than what you'll see a lot of sourdough starters. I do like to add just a little bit of honey to my freshly milled loaves. You don't have to. They're still really delicious, but we like just a little bit of honey in ours. You don't have to do that though. And I'm going to mix that up, and then I'm going to add my flour. Now, it really depends on the recipe you're using. As I'm recording this, I'm making a new recipe for the blog for a garlic and herb sourdough bread, and it is done in grams. And so you either want to weigh out your flour or use, your cup measurements. I think for this particular loaf, I use 1 cup of water, half a cup of sourdough starter, and 3 cups of flour, and 1.5 teaspoons of salt. But you can take any artisan loaf bread recipe you find and just use freshly milled flour, especially, if it's in grams. It would be the same. And so the only difference is when I make my loaves with freshly milled flour, I'm going to let it soak for an hour before I come and start doing the stretch and folds. Whole grain flour is going to absorb water a little differently because it does have the germ and the bran intact. Those can be a little sharp, and so you want to make sure that you give it time to break or soften those so that you can build your gluten in the process. And so that's what I like to do. Now, don't really worry too much about like hydrations, and make a dough that's manageable to you as you're learning to use freshly milled flour. I like a soft dough that is not too sticky, but is definitely not dry. And so I find that 1 cup of water to 3 cups of freshly milled flour makes for a really good consistency. And I wanted to show you that. I usually finish mixing my doughs with my hand to pick up any dry flour. You don't really have to do that because as you let it sit for the hour, it will absorb it. And so what I like to do is just kind of make sure it's all mixed together. You can see I can touch it, and it's not so sticky that my hands are getting completely covered in dough. It's just sticky, but not like overly sticky. So what I do is I cover mine with these little plastic bowl covers. I get these on Amazon, and I usually use 2 because our house is super dry right now because we have a fire in the wood stove. And I am going to let that sit for an hour and reassemble my grain mill and put it back together because I like to leave mine ready to go. And that's one thing, like I said, I would like to have a lid for this one. And maybe they'll come up with one. We'll see. But here it is after an hour, and I want to show you the differences. When you stretch the dough, you want to stretch it until you feel like it's going to break, but don't stretch it so much that it does break. And so just kind of take your time on this part. I usually do several stretch and folds. I'm only going to show you a few here because it's kind of repetitive what you do. But I did want to show you enough of them to let you gauge that difference in the way that the dough is stretching. Now, every time in between, I put the cover back on, and I just keep coming back after 30 minutes or so. Now, as you can see, it's kind of spread out in the bowl, and it's going to be stretchier this time. It's going to keep getting stretchier every single time. I like to shake it just a little, make sure I get a good stretch, and that's what's going to give you a really nice loaf of bread. It'll give you good structure. It builds the gluten, and all of this really comes down to wanting a good rise in the oven. Now that's leading me to another point. When you're making all freshly milled sourdough bread, just keep in mind that the artisan bread is not going to have those huge holes inside like with all-purpose flour. It's heavier. It has bran, it has germ, and so it's just not as light and airy. But it does still leave you with a really nice crumb. And now we're getting to the end. I have built up quite a bit. This is my last, I think, stretch and fold. I built up quite a bit of structure in this dough, and so it is holding together more in between the stretch and folds. And that tells me that I'm good. I'm going to just cover it and let it rise for about 5 or 6 hours. Now, it really depends on your starter, how strong it is. It depends on the temperature in your house. But things that you can look for is that a good fermented dough is going to be kind of domed on the top. It spreads out some in the bowl, and you can touch it and you can feel that there's an airiness to the dough. You see how that dough ball looks there. It's kind of tight, and it's not spread out at all, and it doesn't feel airy at all. Now it's getting dark. It gets dark so early now, which I love this time of the year, so I'm not complaining. But I'm going to get my dough into the Banneton basket so I can get it in the fridge. I love to do this because not only does it add a tremendous amount of flavor because it's a cold fermentation, but it slows down that fermentation process, and I don't have to worry about it over fermenting on the counter overnight. On this particular day, my dough rose for, I think it was 6 hours, and that was perfect. It was airy, it was light, it was soft, and I could tell that it was going to make for a good loaf of bread. Now, when you shape the dough, you pretty much do the stretch and fold again. You gently stretch each piece up and over the center to make a ball, and then you want to turn it over and drag it. Now, make sure you get the flour out of the way. Drag it around, and I do this many times because I want to build a good tension on the top of this dough so that it doesn't lose its shape when it is rising in the Banneton basket overnight in the fridge. So you can see that this ball of dough is smooth. You're looking for that. It's not like puckered or anything like that, which would be a sign of over fermentation. You want it to be quite smooth before you put it in the Banneton basket. And it is holding its shape really well. It feels very puffy and airy whenever I handle it. This comes in time. I can tell you it took me a long time to really figure out when the best time was to put my bread in the Banneton basket and get it in the oven. But a good rule of thumb is 4 to 6 hours for a lot of people's, like if you have a really mature starter. 4 to 6 hours is good depending on the temperature. It's cool in our house. I did not put this near the wood stove because I wanted it to ferment a little cooler. The flavor is just insanely good when you use freshly milled flour and you let it ferment at a cooler temperature. Makes the best bread. So I'm stitching up the dough. So you put the bread top side down in the Banneton basket and stitch up the seam. I always add just a little bit of flour so that my linen cloth will not stick to it. I'm going to cover it. I'm going to put the plastic back on it, and it goes in the fridge overnight, and it slows everything down. I don't get in a big hurry to bake it off, but usually I bake it off sometime in the morning the next day. And so that's what we're getting to now. This dough that you're about to see has been in the oven overnight. It is so puffy. It feels like it's completely full of air, which is exactly what you want. I use a bread sling, but you can use parchment paper for this. And you want to turn it over. There's our beautiful loaf. I'm sorry for the lighting. It's dark outside, and I turned my overhead light on, and it's kind of glary. But now we're just going to slash it, and you can do whatever slash that you want. You can get fancy. I never do. I just do just a little design. And then I like to take my razor blade and kind of go horizontally on that slash so that it opens up a little bit more. But here is the loaf of bread out of the oven. And as you can see, this is all freshly milled flour, and it's a beautiful loaf of bread. I hope that this was helpful for you if you're brand new to this journey. If you have any questions, let me know, and we'll see you on the next video.